the man who knew the waters. Thomas, Old Tom, McAllister had spent 63 years reading the moods of the Solomon Sea. Every reef, every current, every treacherous shoal between Guadalcanal and San Cristobal was mapped in the weathered folds of his brain with greater accuracy than any naval chart could provide. The local said he could smell a storm coming 3 days before the sky showed a single cloud, and they weren't entirely wrong. When the war came to the Pacific in 1942, Tom had watched from his small fishing village as the world's navies turned his peaceful waters into a graveyard of steel. He'd seen Japanese destroyers slice through the dawn mist like gray ghosts, and American carriers that blocked out the sun. The young men from the village had gone to fight, and Tom, too old for any uniform, had stayed behind with the elderly, the children, and a handful of resistance fighters who melted into the jungle hills. On a sweltering morning in August, Tom was mending nets on his aging boat when he spotted something that made his salt-crusted eyes narrow. 3 Japanese destroyers were moving in formation toward the northern channel, their course steady and purposeful. But it was the 4th ship, a heavy cruiser hanging back like a shepherd with its flock, that caught his attention. Tom had seen this pattern before, not with warships, but with merchant convoys. They were scouting, looking for a safe passage through the treacherous waters to establish a supply route. And if Tom's decades of experience meant anything, they were about to make a fatal mistake. He knew these waters held a secret that no chart had ever properly documented, a submerged coral formation that created a natural trap. At high tide, it was invisible, offering what appeared to be a deep-water channel perfect for large vessels. But when the tide turned, that channel became a maze of razor-sharp coral reefs that could gut a ship's hull like a fish. The old fisherman watched the Japanese ships disappear around the headland, then turned his boat toward Henderson Field, where the Americans had established their base. The young ensign at the dock had laughed at him before, called him a crazy old salt when he'd tried to offer advice about local waters. But today, Tom carried information that might turn the tide of the naval campaign in the Solomons, if anyone would listen. As his engine puttered toward the American base, Tom rehearsed his pitch. He knew how it would sound, a weather-beaten fisherman claiming he could trap an entire Japanese fleet using nothing but tide tables and coral formations. He'd dealt with the skepticism of young men his entire life. Sailors who thought their modern instruments and nautical training made them masters of the sea, only to run aground on reefs that Tom could have warned them about. But this was different. This was war, and the Americans were desperate. The naval battles around Guadalcanal had been brutal, with both sides losing precious ships in the narrow waters between the islands. The Americans needed every advantage they could get, and Tom held knowledge that might be worth more than a dozen torpedo bombers. The base came into view, its hastily constructed buildings and camouflaged fuel depots sprawling along the coast. Fighter planes roared overhead, returning from patrol. Tom could see the organized chaos of a military installation at war. Trucks hauling supplies, sailors rushing between buildings, radio antennas bristling like metallic forests. He tied up his boat and stepped onto the dock, his joints protesting after years of hauling nets and fighting storms. A young Marine with a rifle approached, eyeing the old civilian with suspicion. "I need to speak with your naval intelligence officer," Tom said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd survived 6 decades at sea. "I have information about Japanese ship movements and a way to trap them." The Marine's expression suggested he thought Tom was either drunk or senile. But something in the old fisherman's eyes, a certainty born of countless voyages through these waters, made him pause. "Wait here," the Marine finally said, and disappeared into the nearest building. Tom stood on the dock, feeling the familiar rhythm of the tide beneath his feet, and hoped that someone would listen before it was too late. The skeptical officers. Commander James Hartford had endured 3 years of war in the Pacific, and in that time, he learned to filter useful intelligence from the constant stream of rumors, speculation, and well-meaning, but ultimately useless civilian reports. So when a Marine brought in a leathery old fisherman claiming he could trap a Japanese fleet, Hartford's first instinct was to send him away with a polite dismissal. But Lieutenant Sarah Chun, the base's intelligence analyst, had insisted they hear him out. Chen had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, the daughter of immigrants who'd taught her to respect the wisdom of elders and the value of local knowledge. She'd been one of the first Asian American women commissioned in the Navy, and she'd fought twice as hard to prove herself in a service that still looked at her with suspicion. Tom sat across from Hartford and Shun in the sweltering operations room, a ceiling fan doing little to combat the tropical heat. Large maps of the Solomon Islands covered the walls, marked with pins indicating known Japanese positions. Hartford leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, while Chun took notes with careful precision. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Hartford said, his tone walking the line between patience and condescension. "You're suggesting that we lure Japanese warships into a channel that will trap them at low tide?" "Not suggesting, Commander," Tom replied, his calloused hands spread flat on the table. "Telling you that the Japanese are already scouting that route. I watched them this morning, 3 destroyers and a heavy cruiser, moving north along the coast." Shun looked up from her notes. "Did you get close enough to identify the vessels?" "Close enough to see they were heading straight for the Kalau Channel," Tom said. "And that's the trap. At high tide, it looks like a perfect deep-water route between the islands. Wide, protected from the open ocean, ideal for moving heavy ships. But when the tide goes out, coral formations rise up that can tear the bottom out of anything bigger than my fishing boat." Hartford stood and moved to the map on the wall, studying the area Tom described. "We have charts of this region. There's no indication of major hazards in that channel." "Your charts are wrong," Tom said flatly. "Drawn by people who passed through once or twice, probably at high tide. I've fished these waters for 40 years. I know where every reef lies, every current runs. The Kalau Channel is a death trap, but only if you know the tide schedule." Shin set down her pen. "What makes you think the Japanese would use this route?" Tom's weather-beaten face creased into something resembling a smile. "Because they're smart. Look at your map, Lieutenant. The Kalau Channel offers protected passage from their northern bases down to Guadalcanal. Avoids the open ocean where your submarines hunt. Keeps them close to the islands where they can use the jungle for air cover. If I were planning a supply route, that's exactly where I'd go." Hartford remained skeptical. "Even if you're right about the hazards, we can't exactly order a Japanese fleet to sail into a trap. What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we give them a reason to use that channel," Tom said, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining something obvious. "Make it look like the perfect opportunity. A fat target moving through at just the right time." Chun leaned forward, her analytical mind already working through the possibilities. "You want to use a decoy. Draw them in when the tide's right." "Exactly," Tom said, nodding with approval. "Japanese scouts saw American patrol boats using the southern channels yesterday. I watched them watching. If we make it look like we're moving valuable assets through Kalau Channel, they'll see it as a chance to catch us in restricted waters where their superior numbers matter. They'll commit ships to intercept." Hartford's skepticism began to crack. He'd seen enough naval engagements to know that fighting in narrow waters neutralized many tactical advantages. And when does the tide turn deadly? Tom pulled a worn notebook from his pocket, filled with decades of tide observations written in cramped handwriting. "High tide peaks at 0600 hours tomorrow. Perfect deep water passage. But by 1100 hours, those reefs will be 6 feet below the surface. Invisible but deadly. Any ship drawing more than 20 feet will start hitting coral. Destroyers might make it through damaged. Anything heavier will be stuck fast. Stuck until the next high tide," Chun said, understanding dawning in her eyes. 12 hours later. Sitting ducks. And even if they get off the reefs," Tom continued, "their hulls will be compromised. Every ship that goes through that channel at the wrong tide is out of action for weeks, maybe months of repairs." Hartford studied the map silently, his tactical mind running through scenarios. The Americans had been taking heavy losses in the naval battles around Guadalcanal. Every Japanese ship they could neutralize without risking their own vessels was a strategic victory. But the plan relied entirely on the word of an old fisherman whose knowledge came from experience rather than formal training. Hartford had built his career on following procedures, trusting verified intelligence, making decisions based on proven data. "This is insane," he finally said. Tom shrugged. "War usually is." Chen looked between the two men. "Commander, we've lost 4 destroyers in the past month fighting in these waters. If there's even a chance this could work." Hartford turned from the map, his decision weighing on him. If he ignored Tom's warning and the old man was right, he'd be letting a tactical opportunity slip away. But if he committed resources based on a fisherman's hunch and it failed, he'd face a court-martial. "I need to run this up the chain," Hartford said finally. "Lieutenant Shun, prepare a full briefing. Include tide tables, ship draft specifications, and every scrap of intelligence we have on Japanese movements in this sector." Tom stood slowly. "When do I get your answer, Commander?" "The Japanese won't wait for our bureaucracy, Mr. McAllister," Hartford replied. "If we do this, it has to be tomorrow. I'll have an answer by nightfall." Convincing the brass. Admiral William Tennant had commanded naval operations in the South Pacific for 8 months, and in that time, he'd signed orders that sent thousands of young men into battle. Some came back. Many didn't. The weight of those decisions had carved deep lines into his face and turned his hair from gray to white. So when Commander Hartford presented him with a fisherman scheme to trap Japanese warships using coral reefs and tide tables, Tennant's first reaction was to dismiss it as desperate fantasy. "Let me understand this," Tennant said, pacing behind his desk in the headquarters building at Noumea. "You want to risk vessels and crews on the word of a civilian who claims he can predict where ships will run aground." Hartford stood at attention, flanked by Lieutenant Shun and, surprisingly, Tom McAllister himself. The old fisherman had insisted on making the trip to New Caledonia, arguing that he needed to explain the plan himself. Shun had supported him, and Hartford, recognizing that Tom's credibility would make or break this proposal, had agreed. "Sir, I initially shared your skepticism," Hartford admitted, "but Lieutenant Chen's analysis supports McAllister's claims. We've cross-referenced his observations with our own intelligence, and the pattern matches. Japanese scouts have been surveying the northern approaches for 3 days. They're planning something." Chun stepped forward, spreading detailed maps across the Admiral's desk. "Sir, I've studied every naval engagement in these waters since we took Henderson Field. We keep losing ships because we're fighting in restricted spaces where Japanese numerical superiority matters. This plan reverses that dynamic." Tennant studied the maps, his experienced eye tracing the proposed route. "Even if the coral formations are where this fisherman claims, we need perfect timing. One mistake, and we lose ships of our own." "With respect, Admiral," Tom spoke up, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension, "you've been losing ships anyway. At least this way, you're not throwing good men into a fair fight. You're using the ocean itself as a weapon." The Admiral's gaze fixed on Tom. "You're asking me to trust your knowledge over our naval charts, Mr. McAllister. Charts prepared by trained cartographers. Trained cartographers who passed through once," Tom replied without flinching. "I've fished these waters since before most of your cartographers were born. I've seen ships go down on reefs that aren't on any map. I've pulled bodies from waters that charts mark as safe passage." The room fell silent. Tennant's jaw tightened. He'd seen too many bodies himself, burned, drowned, blown apart by shells and torpedoes. The old fisherman was right about one thing. They were losing ships anyway. "What's our risk exposure?" Tennant asked Hartford. "We'd use PT boats as bait," Hartford explained. "Fast, maneuverable, small crews. If the Japanese don't take the bait, we're out nothing but fuel. If they do pursue, and McAllister's timeline is correct, we position destroyers at both ends of the channel and catch them trapped on the reefs. And if McAllister's timeline is wrong, then our PT boats are fast enough to escape, and we've wasted a day," Chen interjected. "But sir, the intelligence supports this. Japanese supply lines are stretched thin. They need a protected route to reinforce their positions. The Callao Channel offers exactly that, if they don't know about the reefs." Tennant moved to the window, looking out over Noumea Harbor, where damaged American ships sat in dry dock, evidence of the brutal naval campaign. He thought about the intelligence reports on his desk, Japanese reinforcements moving south, their navy still powerful despite recent losses, time running out to secure the Solomons. What guarantee can you give me that these reefs exist as you describe? He asked Tom without turning around. None, Tom said honestly, except my word and 40 years of not drowning. But I'll tell you what I told your commander. I watched those Japanese scouts with my own eyes. They're coming, whether you're ready or not. I'm giving you a chance to choose the battlefield. Tennant turned back to face them. If this fails, Commander Hartford, your career is over. You understand that? Yes, sir. And if it succeeds, nobody will believe it wasn't just dumb luck. I can live with that, sir. The Admiral looked at each of them in turn. Hartford with his career on the line, Chun with her careful analysis, and Tom with his weather-beaten certainty. Then he looked back at the maps on his desk, at the narrow channel that might be a trap or might be nothing but an old man's fantasy. We'll do it, Tennant said finally. But on my conditions. I want reconnaissance flights over that channel today, looking for any signs of these coral formations. I want hydrographic teams taking depth soundings at the specific locations McAllister identifies. And I want our best submarine in position to observe. If this goes wrong, I need eyewitness confirmation of what happened. Understood, Sir Hartford said. One more thing, Tennant added, his gaze settling on Tom. You're going with them, McAllister. If you're right, you'll guide our ships through safely. If you're wrong, he let the implication hang in the air. Tom nodded slowly. Fair enough, Admiral. I'll guide them through. As they left the headquarters building, Chin caught up with Tom. You didn't have to volunteer to go with us. Yes, I did, Tom replied, squinting at the afternoon sun. I'm asking young men to risk their lives on my word. Least I can do is risk my own neck alongside them. Preparing the trap. Dawn broke over Henderson Field with the same oppressive humidity that had marked every morning since the Marines landed. Tom stood on the dock watching sailors prepare 4 PT boats for what might be either a brilliant tactical victory or a catastrophic miscalculation. He'd barely slept, spending the night going over his tide calculations again and again, checking them against decades of observations recorded in his weather notebooks. Lieutenant Commander Michael Russo, skipper of PT 109 sister boat, approached with 2 cups of coffee. Despite commanding one of the Navy's most dangerous vessels, Russo looked barely old enough to buy a drink. Another reminder that this war belonged to the young. McAllister, Russo said, offering one of the cups. Hartford says you're riding with us. Ever been on a PT boat before? Can't say I have, Tom admitted, accepting the coffee. Fastest thing I've piloted is my fishing boat, and she tops out at about 8 knots. Russo grinned. We do 45. Try not to fall overboard when we open her up. Tom studied the sleek vessel tied to the dock. The PT boat looked like a thoroughbred compared to his sturdy fishing trawler. All speed and weapons, built for hit-and-run attacks rather than the patient work of hauling nets. 3 torpedo tubes, multiple machine guns, and engines that could push the boat faster than most people could drive a car. You believe this plan will work? Russo asked, his grin fading into something more serious. I know these waters, Tom replied, but believing and knowing aren't always the same thing when you're betting lives on it. Across the base, Lieutenant Chun worked with the reconnaissance pilots, reviewing their footage from yesterday's flights over the call-out channel. The images weren't perfect. Water conditions and angle made it difficult to spot submerged features, but dark shadows beneath the surface suggested formations that matched Tom's descriptions. Commander Hartford stood in the operations room, studying the latest intelligence reports. Japanese radio traffic had increased significantly overnight, and coast watchers reported increased ship movements near their northern bases. Everything suggested the enemy was preparing a major operation. Commander, Chun entered, carrying photographs. The recon flights confirm significant coral formations in the channel, exactly where McAllister indicated. Hydrography teams couldn't get close enough for detailed soundings without risking detection, but their remote readings support his tide predictions. Hartford examined the photos, noting how the shadows in the water aligned with marks on Tom's hand-drawn charts. The submarines in position. USS Grayback is stationed at the mouth of the channel, observation distance. Captain Wilson reports he has clear sight lines and can surface to provide fire support if needed. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Hartford, check his watch. High tide is at 0600. We need to be visible in the channel by 0630, making enough noise to attract attention, but not so much that it looks like a trap. For PT boats running patrol patterns, Chun said, normal enough to be believable, valuable enough to be worth pursuing. And McAllister sure about the timing? Chun hesitated. You show me 40 years of tide records, Commander. The man knows these waters like you know your own ship. But he's also honest enough to admit that predicting exactly when warships will start hitting reef is more art than science. Hartford nodded grimly. Then we'd better pray his art is better than our science. By 0530, the PT boats were ready. Tom climbed aboard Russo's vessel, noting how everything was secured for high-speed maneuvering. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, checking weapons and engines with the casual competence of men who'd already survived more combat than most soldiers would see in a lifetime. Ever fire a machine gun, old-timer? One sailor asked, not unkindly. Shot plenty of sharks that got in my nets, Tom replied. Figure Japanese destroyers are bigger targets. The sailor laughed, the tension breaking slightly. They all knew what they were heading into. 4 small boats trying to bait a wolf pack of warships into a trap that might not exist. At 0545, the PT boats motored out of Henderson Field, their engines rumbling with barely contained power. The plan was simple on paper. Enter the Callao Channel at high tide, conduct obvious patrol patterns, and wait for Japanese scouts to report their presence. Intelligence suggested enemy ships were already positioned to intercept targets in these waters. Tom sat near Russo, feeling the unfamiliar vibration of the powerful engines beneath him. His own boat puttered along like a friendly dog. This vessel felt like a caged panther, all muscle and aggression barely held in check. 0600, high tide, Russo announced as they entered the channel. The water looked deep and inviting, a perfect passage between the islands. Tom knew that in 5 hours, this innocent-looking waterway would become a death trap. If he was right, if his decades of observation and experience translated correctly to warships drawing 3 times the depth of his fishing boat. If the Japanese took the bait. If the tide tables he'd kept in cramped handwriting were accurate enough to bet men's lives on. Contact, the radar operator called out. Surface vessels, bearing north-northwest, range 15 miles. 3 no for ships, destroyers, and what looks like a heavy cruiser. Russo exchanged glances with Tom. That was fast. They were waiting, Tom said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline starting to pump through his old veins. Waiting for a target worth chasing. Then let's give them a show, Russo said, and opened the throttle. The chase begins. The PT boats roared to life with a sound like thunder contained in metal, and Tom grabbed the nearest handhold as Russo's vessel leaped forward. The acceleration pressed him back against his seat, water spraying in sheets as the bow lifted and the boat planed across the surface at speeds Tom had never experienced on water. The islands on either side of the Callao Channel blurred past in streaks of green jungle and white beach. They're taking the bait, the radar operator shouted over the engine roar. Japanese destroyers increasing speed, bearing directly for us. ETA to engagement range, 18 minutes. Tom checked his watch, 0647. High tide had peaked 17 minutes ago, which meant the water was already beginning its inexorable retreat. The ocean breathed in and out twice daily, and right now was exhaling. In 4 hours and 13 minutes, if his calculations were correct, those coral formations would rise high enough to threaten anything drawing more than 18 feet. 4 boats aren't much of a prize, Russo said, keeping his eyes on the water ahead. Why commit that much firepower to chase us? Because we're not the prize, Tom replied, understanding the Japanese tactical thinking. We're the key to the supply route. They eliminate our patrol boats. They can move heavy transports through this channel. Worth the risk of a few destroyers. Chin's voice crackled over the radio from the command post at Henderson Field. PT 109 Group, Intelligence confirms enemy formation is the Sendai, Hatsuki, Fubuki, and destroyer Murasame. Heavy armament, superior speed and range. Do not engage directly. Repeat, maintain evasion protocols. Copy that, Russo acknowledged, then muttered to his crew, as if we could take on a cruiser in a fair fight. The 4 PT boats split into 2 pairs, executing practiced evasion patterns. Their advantage lay in maneuverability and shallow draft. They could operate in waters where larger vessels feared to go, or so the Japanese Navy believed. Today, Tom hoped to prove that even destroyers weren't immune to the ocean's hidden dangers. They're closing fast, the radar operator warned. Range now 12 miles and dropping. They're doing 32 knots. Tom pulled out his charts, comparing their position to the carefully marked hazard zones. We need to slow down, Lieutenant Commander. Let them get closer. Russo looked at him like he'd suggested swimming with sharks. Slow down? Those destroyers outrange our guns by miles. We slow down, we're target practice. Trust me, Tom said, his voice carrying the weight of those 40 years at sea. We need them committed to this course. If they think they can catch us in the next hour, they'll follow us right into the trap. Russo wrestled with the decision for 3 heartbeats, then reluctantly throttled back. The PT boat settled deeper into the water, still fast but no longer racing at maximum speed. Through binoculars, Tom could now see the Japanese formation. 3 destroyers in a hunting line with the cruiser Sendai hanging back, exactly as he'd predicted. The lead destroyer, Fubuki, began firing rangy shots. Waterspouts erupted 200 yards behind the nearest PT boat, massive plumes of white water that showed the devastating power of 5-inch guns. Each shell carried enough explosive force to vaporize the small American boats. Taking fire, Russo announced unnecessarily. Everyone could see the deadly fountains walking toward them. Evasive maneuvers. The PT boats began weaving, their agility making them difficult targets at this range. But the Japanese were closing the gap, and their accuracy would only improve with distance. Tom checked his watch again. 0714. 3 hours and 46 minutes until the reefs rose high enough to threaten the destroyers. Contact Henderson Field, Tom said urgently. Tell them we need to keep this dance going for at least 3 more hours. The Japanese can't lose interest or break off pursuit. Chen's voice came back over the radio. How do we keep them interested without getting blown out of the water? Russo grinned savagely. By showing just enough teeth to make them angry. He keyed his radio to the other PT boats. All vessels, execute attack pattern Delta. Fire torpedoes on my mark, but aim to miss. We want them pissed off, not sunk. The 4 PT boats suddenly reversed course, charging directly at the Japanese formation in what looked like a suicidal attack run. Tom's knuckles went white, gripping the handhold as the distance closed with terrifying speed. The Japanese destroyers grew from silhouettes to massive steel monsters, their guns swiveling to track the approaching threats. 500 yards, the torpedo officer counted down. 400, 300. Fire torpedoes, Russo commanded. 3 Mark 8 torpedoes dropped from their tubes with explosive charges that kicked up spray, immediately engaging their motors and streaking through the water at 46 knots. Russo had aimed them to pass ahead of the Japanese formation, close enough to force evasive action, but unlikely to actually hit. The destroyers spotted the torpedo wakes and responded exactly as Russo hoped, turning hard to avoid what they perceived as a coordinated attack. Their formation broke apart, each ship maneuvering independently, their attention completely focused on the aggressive little boats that had just shown their teeth. Break off! Break off! Russo shouted, throwing the PT boat into a hard turn that nearly threw Tom from his seat. The other boats executed similar maneuvers, and suddenly they were racing back down the channel at maximum speed while the Japanese destroyers, now thoroughly provoked, reformed and gave chase with renewed fury. They're really mad now, the radar operator reported. All 4 ships in pursuit, speed increasing to maximum. Tom allowed himself a thin smile. The Japanese commander had just committed to a course of action driven by anger and tactical pride. He would chase these impudent American boats through the Callao Channel, sink them, and establish Japanese naval superiority in these waters. And in 3 hours and 37 minutes, if Tom's lifetime of knowledge held true, that commander would discover that the ocean played by its own rules, rules that no amount of steel or firepower could break. The waiting game. The next 3 hours became an endless dance of death across water that sparkled deceptively in the morning sun. The Japanese destroyers pursued relentlessly, their powerful engines pushing them through the Callao Channel at speeds that sent massive bow waves crashing against the jungle-covered shores. Behind them, the heavy cruiser Sendai maintained position, ready to cut off any escape route the Americans might attempt. Tom sat in Russo's PT boat, dividing his attention between his watch and the shoreline. He'd marked specific trees, rock formations, and beach features in his mental map of these waters, natural tide markers he'd used for decades. The exposed roots of a particular mangrove tree meant water level had dropped 3 feet. The appearance of a distinctive coral head near the eastern shore meant another 2 feet gone. 0915 hours, Russo announced, sweat streaming down his face despite the ocean spray. We've been playing tag for over 2 hours. Fuel's getting critical, and the men are exhausted. Tom studied the nearest shore marker, a volcanic rock formation that rose like a broken tooth from the water. Another hour and 20 minutes, he said. That's on the trap springs. A shell from the Fubuki screamed overhead, close enough that Tom felt the displacement of air. It exploded in the water 50 yards ahead, sending up a geyser that drenched the PT boat's deck. The Japanese gunnery was improving with every passing minute. We might not last another hour, Russo said grimly. He keyed his radio. PT 112, status report. Taking water from near misses, came the strained reply from Lieutenant Morrison's boat. Forward compartments flooding. We're down to 28 knots maximum. Tom's jaw tightened. A slower boat was a dead boat in this chase. But Morrison's vessel limping along might actually serve a purpose. Keep him visible, Tom told Russo. The Japanese will focus on the wounded boat. Makes them push harder to catch it. That's a death sentence for Morrison's crew. Not if the trap works in 78 minutes. Russo looked at the old fisherman with new understanding. Tom wasn't just betting on tide tables and coral formations. He was playing a lethal chess game using American lives as pieces, trusting that his knowledge would save them before the Japanese destroyed them. Aboard the destroyer Fubuki, Captain Takashi Yamamoto stood on the bridge, his frustration mounting. These American PT boats had been eluding his task force for hours, darting through waters that should have been killing grounds. But more frustrating than the chase itself was the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The channel is narrowing, his navigator reported. Currents are becoming unpredictable. Yamamoto studied the charts, official Imperial Navy hydrographic surveys that showed clear passage through this channel. Yet his instincts, honed through 3 years of war, whispered warnings. Why hadn't the Americans fled into open water where their speed advantage mattered less? Why did they stay in this increasingly confined space? Depth soundings, he ordered. 42 meters under the keel, Captain. Well within safe parameters. Still, the unease persisted. Yamamoto had survived this long by trusting his instincts, but he'd also survived by being aggressive when opportunity presented itself. These patrol boats represented American reconnaissance capability in waters vital to the upcoming supply operation. Eliminating them justified the risk. Increase speed, he commanded. All ships, prepare for final attack. I want those boats destroyed within the hour. Back on Russo's PT boat, Tom watched his tide markers with increasing tension. 1,015 hours. 20 minutes until his predicted danger zone. The volcanic rock that had been half submerged now stood clear of the water. The mangrove roots he'd mentally marked showed another foot of exposure. Position, he asked Russo. The lieutenant commander checked their navigation. 2 miles south of the Callao Narrows. The channel widens again in about 3 miles. Tom shook his head. We turn around in 19 minutes. Not before. Turn around? In this narrow section? That's suicide. Staying on this course is suicide. Tom countered. In 19 minutes, those destroyers will start feeling resistance. Their hulls will scrape coral they can't see. At their current speed, they won't be able to stop before they've gutted themselves on reefs that will rise another 3 feet in the next hour. Chen's voice crackled over the radio. PT 109 Group. Henderson Field is reading increased Japanese radio traffic. They're calling in air support. Zeros inbound from Rabaul. ETA 45 minutes. You need to extract now. Russo looked at Tom. You heard her. We aboard, or we're facing destroyers and fighters. Tom pulled out his tide tables one final time, checking calculations he'd verified 100 times already. The mathematics of moon and gravity, of ocean and Earth's rotation, all pointed to the same conclusion. In 17 minutes, the trap would be set. 17 minutes, he told Russo. Then we turn and run straight at them. By the time we pass through, they'll be stuck fast. You'd better be right, old man, Russo said, then keyed his radio to all boats. All vessels, maintain course for 17 more minutes. Then we execute a 180-degree turn and make for Henderson Field at maximum speed. Anyone who can't keep up gets left behind. We're not dying because someone's engine quit. The acknowledgments came back tense but professional. These young men had volunteered for the most dangerous job in the Navy, piloting small boats against major warships. They understood calculated risk. Tom counted down the minutes, watching the water level drop inch by inch, watching the Japanese destroyers close the gap, watching the sun climb higher in a sky that would soon fill with enemy aircraft. Everything depended on timing. Too early and the trap would fail. Too late and they'd all die regardless. His watch read 10:34. Time to spring the trap. Now, he told Russo. Turn now. The trap springs. All boats, execute combat turn. Russo's command crackled across the radio, and 4 PT boats simultaneously threw themselves in a violent 180-degree turns that sent rooster tails of spray arcing across the call-out channel. Tom gripped his handhold with both hands as the deck tilted at an impossible angle, the world spinning in a blur of green jungle and blue sky. The PT boats emerged from their turns facing directly at the onrushing Japanese task force, less than 800 yards separating the hunters from their prey. At combined closing speeds exceeding 70 knots, the distance evaporated in heartbeats. Tom could see individual sailors on the Fubuki's deck, could see gun turrets tracking the approaching boats, could see the massive bow wave pushing ahead of the destroyer like a declaration of power. They think we've gone crazy, Russo muttered, his hand steady on the controls despite the insanity of charging 4 destroyers and boats that displaced 70 tons compared to their 2,000. Maybe we have, Tom replied, eyes fixed on the water ahead. He was looking for signs, subtle changes in current patterns, slight discoloration where coral lay close to the surface, the particular way waves broke over submerged formations. His life had been spent reading these signs, and now dozens of lives depended on his interpretation being correct. The Japanese opened fire with everything they had. 5-inch main guns, 3-inch secondary batteries, and multiple machine guns all spoke at once, creating a wall of steel and explosive force. Waterspouts erupted like a field of deadly fountains, shell fragments whining through the air, tracer rounds drawing lines of fire across the morning. Evasive maneuvers. Russo screamed unnecessarily. All 4 PT boats were already weaving desperate patterns, the shallow draft and high speed the only things keeping them alive. A shell hit 20 yards off their starboard side, the concussion wave lifting the entire boat clear of the water for a fraction of a second. Tom felt the world slow down, his senses heightened by adrenaline and decades of survival instincts. They were passing through the danger zone now, his PT boat drawing less than 6 feet. The coral formations lay 10 feet below, deep enough for them, fatal for the destroyers that would arrive seconds later, drawing 25 feet. Now, he shouted at Russo. Full throttle now. Don't slow for anything. The 4 PT boats rocketed forward, passing through the gap between destroyers like bullets through a formation of bombers. The Japanese, focused on the moving targets, didn't notice the water ahead. didn't see the subtle changes Tom had been trained by 40 years of survival to recognize. The Fubuki hit first. At 34 knots, the destroyer's bow rode high in the water, her twin propellers churning. Her captain, focused entirely on the American boats passing beneath his guns, had perhaps 2 seconds of warning when a navigator's voice rose in panic. Depth reading dropping rapidly, 20 meters, 15. The destroyer's keel met submerged coral at combined speed and mass that generated forces beyond calculation. The grinding shriek of metal tearing on rock cut through even the thunder of guns. The Fubuki's bow lifted as her forward momentum transferred into vertical force, and 2,000 tons of warship lurched like a car hitting a curb at highway speed. Yamamoto was thrown against the bridge railing, watching in horror as the water ahead of his ship suddenly showed its true colors, shadows and light patterns that revealed a maze of coral formations where his charts showed clear passage. The second destroyer, Murasame, tried to reverse engines but had no chance at combat speed. She hit the reefs 3 seconds after Fubuki, her propellers shrieking as they chewed into coral before seizing completely. Tom watched from Russo's PT boat as the trap closed. The third destroyer, Hatsuyuki, managed to slow enough that her collision wasn't catastrophic, but she still ground onto a reef that tore a 50-foot gash along her port side. Only the cruiser Sendai, hanging back from the chase, had enough warning to stop, but stopping meant presenting a stationary target, and her position was now broadcasting to every American submarine and aircraft in range. Holy Mother of God, Russo breathed, staring at the scene behind them. 3 Japanese destroyers were stuck fast on reefs, their hulls compromised, their crews scrambling to assess damage. You actually did it, you crazy old bastard. Tom felt no triumph, only exhausted relief. Get on the radio to Henderson Field. Tell them the destroyers are stuck until high tide. That's 12 hours from now. And get destroyers and aircraft out here before that cruiser decides to finish what her escort started. Chen's voice came over the radio, professional despite what must have been shock at headquarters. Confirmed visual on 3 Japanese destroyers aground in Kalau Channel. Dispatching strike aircraft immediately. PT 109 Group, extract to Henderson Field for debriefing. But Russo wasn't listening to the radio. He was staring at his fuel gauge. We're not going to make it back, he said quietly. We burned too much fuel in the chase. We've got maybe 20 minutes of running time left. Tom looked at the other PT boats, all showing similar signs of fuel exhaustion. They'd accomplished their mission, but might die anyway, stranded in waters that would soon be swarming with angry Japanese aircraft. Head for the cove, near Tula Point, Tom said. I've got fuel cache there, drums I buried on the beach 6 months ago, when I thought I might need an emergency supply. It's not Navy standard, but it'll burn in your engines. Russo didn't question how or why a fisherman had buried fuel on a remote beach. He just changed course, and the 4 PT boats, running on fumes and prayers, limped toward the coordinates Tom provided. Behind them, Captain Yamamoto stood on Fubuki's damaged bridge, watching the tide continue its inexorable retreat. His ship's hull groaned as coral formations that had been invisible now rose higher, supporting more and more of the destroyer's weight in ways no ship was designed to handle. Around him, the Kalau Channel revealed itself as the trap it had always been, beautiful, deadly, and known only to those who'd paid the price of decades to lure its secrets. The old fisherman had beaten the Imperial Japanese Navy with nothing but knowledge and timing. And Yamamoto, a student of naval history, recognized he'd just been present for something that would be studied in academies for generations, if anyone believed it had actually happened. Aftermath and legend. 3 days after the Kalau Channel trap, Tom sat in Admiral Tennant's office in Noumea, while staff officers and intelligence analysts filled every available chair. The room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, and maps covered every wall showing the tactical situation in the Solomons. The Admiral had summoned Tom immediately after Japanese radio traffic confirmed what reconnaissance flights had already shown. 3 destroyers so badly damaged they'd had to be scuttled in place, their crews evacuated at terrible cost. The Japanese lost over 400 men in the evacuation, Tennant said, studying the reports on his desk. Their own submarines couldn't get close enough because we'd moved in too fast. They had to use small boats under air cover, and we shot down 9 aircraft in the process. Tom said nothing. 400 young men who'd been doing their duty, who'd followed orders, who'd died because he'd known where the coral grew. The victory tasted bitter. Lieutenant Chun entered carrying more documents. Sir, SINCPAC wants a complete breakdown of how this operation succeeded. They're talking about replicating the strategy throughout the Pacific Theater. You can't replicate it, Tom said quietly. What worked in the Callao Channel won't work anywhere else. Every stretch of water is different. Every tide pattern unique. You need someone who knows each location like I know these waters. Tennant leaned back in his chair. That's exactly what they want to discuss, McAllister. How do we find more people like you? You don't, Tom replied. Knowledge like mine takes decades to build. You can't rush it, can't teach it in a classroom. It's thousands of days on the water, learning currents and reading reefs, surviving storms, and fixing mistakes before they kill you. Commander Hartford, who'd been standing by the window, spoke up. The old man's right, sir. We got lucky. Lucky that McAllister was here, lucky that he cared enough to help, lucky that the Japanese made the tactical decisions we needed them to make. Strategy is one thing. Luck and local knowledge are another. Nevertheless, Tennant said, this operation saved American lives. The Japanese were planning a major reinforcement operation through that channel. We've intercepted communications showing they're now forced to use longer, more vulnerable supply routes. That's weeks added to their logistics timeline. Chin placed a document in front of Tom. You're being recommended for the Navy Distinguished Public Service Award. It's the highest honor we can give a civilian. Tom pushed the paper back across the desk. I don't want medals, Lieutenant. I want this war over so young men like Russo and Morrison can go home. The room fell silent. Finally, Tennant spoke, his voice carrying the weight of command. We all want that, McAllister. But until that day comes, we use every advantage we have. You've just proven that local knowledge can be as deadly as any weapon we've developed. Over the following weeks, the Battle of Callao Channel, as it came to be known, was analyzed, documented, and taught to naval officers studying unconventional tactics. The official report was classified, but rumors spread through the Pacific Fleet. A crazy old fisherman had trapped an entire Japanese task force using nothing but tide tables and coral formations. Tom returned to his fishing village to find it transformed. American military engineers had built a radar station on the hills above the bay, and a small garrison of Marines now protected what had become a strategically valuable location. His neighbors treated him differently now. Half respect, half unease at having someone in their midst who'd killed hundreds with knowledge instead of weapons. One evening, Lieutenant Chun found him mending nets on his boat, the same task he'd been doing when this all began. Commander Hartford wanted me to ask if you'd consider working with naval intelligence permanently, consulting on coastal operations, advising on tactical use of local geography. Tom continued working the nets, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Tell the commander I'm honored, but I'm a fisherman. I know these specific waters because I've spent my life here. Send me somewhere else, and I'm just an old man with guesses. Fair enough, Chin said. She sat down on the dock, letting her legs dangle over the water. Can I ask you something? When you were watching that destroyer hit the reef, the Fubuki, what were you thinking? Tom's hands paused in their work. I was thinking about the captain. He was doing his job, following orders, trusting his charts. And I'd just proven his charts were wrong. 400 men died because I knew something he didn't. Those same men would have killed thousands of Americans if they'd succeeded in their mission, Chen pointed out. I know that, Tom said quietly. Doesn't make it easier. They sat in silence, watching the sun set over water that looked peaceful and innocent. Beneath that surface lay the coral formations that had changed the course of a campaign, reefs that Tom had known about for 40 years but had kept as simple survival knowledge, until survival required sharing that knowledge for a larger purpose. 6 months later, the tide of war in the Pacific turned decisively. The Japanese Navy, already stretched thin, couldn't replace the destroyers lost at Callao Channel quickly enough. Supply routes to their southern positions remained vulnerable, and American forces pressed their advantage. The Solomons campaign, that might have dragged on for years instead, concluded in months. Military historians would debate whether the Callao Channel trap was brilliant strategy or incredible luck. They'd analyze Tom's tide calculations and study the coral formations that had torn apart steel hulls. They'd teach the operation at academies, using it as an example of how unconventional thinking could achieve results beyond technological superiority. But in the fishing village where Tom McAllister returned to his nets and his quiet life, the story was simpler. The old man who knew the waters had shared his knowledge at the right moment, and that knowledge had been as deadly as any torpedo or bomb. Whether that made him a hero or simply a man who'd survived long enough to learn valuable lessons remained a question he'd wrestle with for the rest of his days. Young sailors and Marines stationed at the base would sometimes ask him about the battle, wanting to hear the story from the man who'd planned it. Tom would tell them about reading tides and recognizing coral formations, about the patience required to truly know a place. But he'd always end with the same words. The ocean doesn't take sides in human wars. It just is what it is. I didn't trap those ships, the ocean did. I just knew where and when it would happen. And on quiet evenings when the tide was right, Tom would take his boat out to the Callao Channel and anchor above the spot where the destroyers had foundered. The wrecks were gone now, salvaged or destroyed by American engineers to prevent them from becoming navigational hazards. But Tom could still see them in his memory. Massive ships brought low by the simple truth that steel and firepower meant nothing against knowledge earned through decades of attention and respect. The ocean kept its secrets from those who didn't care to learn them. Tom had cared, had listened, had remembered. And for a brief moment in a long war, that caring had made all the difference.